Snow drifted across the lonely Montana frontier like God himself was shaking feathers from the sky, coating the world in a quiet whiteness that made the land seem softer than it ever truly was. And inside his cabin, Thomas Hale stood alone beside the fire, listening to the wind rattle the shutters as another Christmas Eve settled in without joy, without family, without the warmth he once imagined life out here would bring. He had ordered a mail-order bride months ago, more out of desperation for companionship than desire. Yet after weeks of no letters, no replies, no sign of her arrival, he had finally accepted that she must have changed her mind, that she must have looked at the world and chosen anyone, anywhere other than a widowed rancher with nothing but open land and unspoken grief to his name. But just as he stepped toward the window to close the curtains, a faint knock echoed through the storm, light but certain, the kind of sound that immediately tightened his chest because no neighbor would travel in such weather. And when he opened the heavy wooden door, the wind shoved Snow inside along with the sight of a woman he had never seen but instantly recognized from the one small photograph she had sent, the trembling figure of Eleanor Ward, her cheeks flushed red from the cold, her hair tangled beneath a thin veil, and in her arms, wrapped in a blanket that was barely thick enough for winter, a small newborn child sleeping against her breast as if unaware of the brutal storm around them. Thomas froze, breath stolen, not because she was late or because she had come without warning, but because she had come with a baby, another man's baby, and for a moment he felt the sting of disappointment thread itself through his ribs. Yet even stronger than disappointment was the instinct he had learned long ago from losing his first wife. From watching the world break people who deserved kindness, he stepped back, opening the door wider, letting the warm glow of his home spill onto her shaking figure as Eleanor pressed one hand against the doorframe to steady herself, whispering through chattering teeth that the train had been delayed, robbed, abandoned, and she had walked the last miles on foot because she had nowhere else to go, no one else who would take her. And she understood if he turned her away. But Thomas, with a slow breath and the gentleness he didn't know still lived inside him, told her softly that no one carrying a child on Christmas Eve would ever be left in the snow at his doorstep, not while he still drew breath. And as the little girl sleeping on the cot behind him stirred and blinked up at the stranger with innocent curiosity, the cabin suddenly felt fuller, brighter, as if the night itself had delivered. A miracle he never thought he would receive, one wrapped not in perfection but in need, the kind of need a man could build a life around if he were brave enough to try. And in that moment, Thomas Hale silently vowed that whatever story had brought Eleanor to his door, whatever heartache she carried, whatever secrets lived behind the tears filling her eyes, he would not let her face them alone anymore. Because sometimes destiny arrived not as a promise, but as a mother and child standing in the snow, waiting for someone to simply say, "Come inside." "You're safe now," Eleanor stepped into the cabin as if crossing the threshold between two worlds, the bitter cold behind her and a hesitant warmth ahead, her boots soaked, her dress heavy with melted snow, her arms trembling as she clutched the tiny bundle closer to her chest. And for the first time since she had boarded the train weeks ago, she felt a flicker of safety, though it was tangled with fear, that Thomas might still change his mind once he understood the truth she carried. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with amber light, and as she blinked away the snowflakes clinging to her lashes, she became aware of the small blonde girl watching her with wide, unblinking eyes, her little hand still clutching a wooden horse as though caught mid-play, and Eleanor offered a faint, unsure smile, whispering hello as the child shyly tucked herself behind Thomas's leg, peeking out again with curiosity rather than fear, which made Eleanor's heart soften in a way she hadn't expected. Thomas moved quietly, gently taking her wet cloak from her shoulders, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant, and when his fingers brushed the fabric of the blanket, he paused, not in judgment, not in frustration, but in the silent way a man pauses when he realizes the world has asked too much of someone who has already given more than she should have had to. And with a slow nod, he gestured toward the rocking chair by the fire, insisting she sit before her knees gave out, which she did with a grateful exhale, sinking into the creaking wood as warmth spread across her frozen limbs. The baby stirred, a soft cry escaping his tiny lips, and Eleanor instinctively rocked him, humming a lullaby she barely remembered learning, while Thomas knelt beside the chair, studying the child with a gaze she couldn't decipher. There was no anger, no rejection, only a deep, searching contemplation, as if he were trying to understand how fate had chosen this specific Christmas Eve to bring a woman and infant to a man who had sworn years ago that he would, never open his heart again. Eleanor lowered her eyes, bracing for questions she feared answering. But Thomas simply asked her if the baby had a name, and after a moment of hesitation she whispered, "Samuel, after my brother," her voice breaking slightly because Samuel had been the only family she had left until tragedy had taken him too, leaving her alone with a future she had never imagined. Thomas nodded again, repeating the name softly as though testing the weight of it, and the innocence in his tone disarmed her enough to tell him the child was only 5 weeks old, born on a night she thought she might die from the cold and the loneliness, and that she had signed the agreement to become his wife long before she knew she was carrying another man's child, before the world had turned upside down and she had been forced to choose survival over reputation. She expected him to recoil, or at least to stiffen, but instead he rose slowly, walked to the stove, and poured her a cup of warm broth, thin, humble but comforting, before handing it to her with steady hands that betrayed none of the turmoil he must have felt. Outside, the wind howled like a lonely beast circling the cabin, yet inside a fragile peace began to form, and Thomas's daughter took tentative steps toward Eleanor, reaching a small hand toward the baby's blanket with innocent fascination, asking if she could see him. And Eleanor, heart swelling, gently lowered the cloth to reveal the sleeping face beneath. The child gasped softly, marveling as though she had found a treasure, and Thomas watched from the side, his expression soft, contemplative, touched by something he had not felt in years. Maybe hope, maybe purpose. And as the firelight danced across the wooden walls, casting shadows that seemed to breathe with the room itself, Eleanor realized that the man before her was not simply tolerating her presence, nor merely fulfilling an obligation. He was choosing, moment by moment, to make room for her and for the tiny life she protected, and though fear still curled in her chest like a stubborn ghost, she felt for the first time in months that perhaps God had not abandoned her on the long, cold road after all, but had led her to a place where her shattered life could be pieced together, again by hands that were gentle, steady, and unexpectedly kind. As the storm outside intensified, rattling the shutters and layering the world in deeper snow, an unusual stillness settled within the cabin, a fragile quiet that felt almost sacred, as though the universe itself had paused to watch what would unfold. Between 3 strangers brought together by fate, Eleanor leaned back in the rocking chair, exhaustion finally catching up to her, her eyelids heavy but her mind still, alert with the fear that if she let herself drift for even a moment, everything might disappear, the warmth, the shelter, the kindness Thomas had shown, and she would wake to find herself back on the frozen road, alone with her child. But Thomas, noticing the battle behind her weary eyes, spoke softly from across the room, telling her she didn't need to stay awake to prove anything, that anyone who made that impossible journey through the snow already had more strength than most men he'd known, and the sincerity in his voice made her throat ache. With an emotion she had buried long ago, he tended to the fire, adding another log, the orange glow illuminating the quiet pride in his movements, and then he lifted his daughter, little Mary, into his arms, whispering for her to fetch the spare quilt from his bedroom, which the child did with delight.